The rain was relentless that night, hammering the windshield of Marcus Williams's beat-up Ford pickup like 1,000 tiny fists. The wipers struggled to keep up, squeaking back and forth across the glass. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the two-lane highway stretched ahead in a blur of silver and shadow. Marcus hunched forward slightly, eyes weary, body aching from another 12-hour shift at the auto shop. His hands were stained with grease, his boots soaked, and all he could think about was getting home to his daughter, Lily. 15 minutes more, and he'd be home. That thought kept him going. The radio crackled with static. Then the familiar voice of a weatherman warned again of flash floods sweeping through the outskirts of Chicago. Marcus turned the volume down and leaned into the wheel. Most folks had stayed off the roads tonight. Smart people. People who weren't trying to make ends meet with 2 jobs and a 10-year-old daughter who still needed help with homework. As he rounded a bend, his headlights caught something up ahead, flashing hazards blinking through the sheets of rain. A car. Sleek. Expensive. Definitely out of place on this stretch of road. Marcus slowed instinctively, his eyes narrowing. As he approached, he saw a tall man standing beside it, partially hunched, trying to shield himself from the downpour. The man glanced up, his soaked jacket clinging to a frame that was unmistakably older, but strong. For a moment, Marcus considered driving on. He was cold, tired. Lily would be waiting, and Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor, wouldn't leave until he got back. And someone in a car like that. They probably had a premium roadside assistance plan and a smartphone full of contacts, but something in Marcus's chest tugged at him. Maybe it was the way his mother used to say, if you see someone in trouble and you can help, don't ask if it's your business. It already is. He pulled over. Grabbing his toolbox from the back, he jogged over, shielding his head with one arm. You need a hand, he called over the sound of the storm. The man looked up, surprised, then nodded. Flat tire, he said simply. Couldn't get the jack to set right in this weather. Marcus crouched next to the wheel without waiting. The man stepped back. I'm a mechanic, Marcus muttered, half to himself. Gotcha covered. The car was some kind of vintage roadster, the kind Marcus had only seen in magazines. He found the jack point, adjusted it carefully, and began working without hesitation. Rain soaked through his jacket, his jeans, his boots. Didn't matter. His hands moved by memory. The man, to his credit, held a small flashlight, helping silently. Every now and then, he glanced at Marcus, as if curious, but he didn't speak much. 20 minutes later, the spare was in place. Marcus tightened the lug nuts, lowered the car, and packed his tools. Should hold till you get a proper one, he said. The man nodded. Let me pay you for your time, he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a wallet. A neat stack of bills appeared hundreds. Maybe. Marcus shook his head and took a step back. Not necessary. I insist, the man said, more firmly. You didn't have to stop. No, Marcus said, his voice even. I didn't. But someone helped me once. And someone helped them before that. Just pass it on, man. Help someone else when they need it. The man stared at him for a long moment. Not judgmental, not offended, just thoughtful. Then he nodded, slowly, and put the wallet away. Thank you, he said. Marcus offered a tired smile and headed back to his truck, soaked to the bone, toolbox in hand. He didn't look back, didn't see the man watching him disappear into the rain. He turned the heater on full blast as he pulled away, the warmth creeping in slowly. It wasn't money that made him feel better. It was the simple satisfaction of doing something right, even when it wasn't easy. Marcus had no idea who that man was, no idea what kind of life he just brushed against on a lonely road in the rain, and no idea that a quiet act of kindness was about to echo louder than he could ever imagine. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. By the time Marcus pulled into the cracked parking lot of Oak Ridge Apartments, The rain had softened to a steady whisper. The lot was half lit, the building's faded brick soaked dark from the storm. He parked in the usual corner spot, engine ticking as it cooled. He sat for a moment, letting the heater blow warm air across his face. Eyes closed. Just a few more steps. One more flight of stairs, then home. Apartment 2B greeted him with the familiar creak of hinges and the scent of old wood and something faintly floral. Mrs. Chen's cooking drifting in from next door. Inside, the air was warm. Lived in. The living room lamp was on, casting soft light over the second-hand couch and the frayed rug that Lily loved to sit on when she read. Mrs. Chen looked up from her knitting as Marcus stepped in, drenched. "Storm's still bad out there," she said gently. "Bad enough to drown the whole street." Marcus offered a tired smile. "It's easing up now. Sorry I'm late." She waved him off. "Lily's been good. Ate her dinner, did her homework, brushed her teeth. She's reading in her room." Marcus nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I don't know what we'd do without you." She stood, gathering her things. "You do fine. You always do." Then she slipped out, the door clicking softly shut behind her. Marcus walked down the narrow hallway, tapping lightly on Lily's door. "Hey, basketball star. Can I come in? Dad?" Her voice lit up the room before he even opened the door. She sat cross-legged on her bed, a book in her lap and her hair still slightly damp from her bath. "You're soaked," she said, eyes wide. "I helped someone on the road," Marcus said, pulling off his wet jacket. "Flat tire in the storm." Lily nodded, impressed. "Did they say thank you?" "They did," he said, smiling. "And I told them what your mom used to say. Just help someone else someday," Lily recited. Proud. "That's the one." He sat beside her, resting his hand on the teddy bear tucked under her arm. "Did you eat, Mrs. Chen made soup, chicken and noodles." "Good," Marcus said. "She's better at cooking than I'll ever be." They talked a while about school, basketball practice, how Lily was trying to master her layup. She showed him a new drawing she'd done, the three of them on a beach. Even though her mom had been gone for nearly 3 years, the lines were shaky, but the love was clear. When it was time for bed, Marcus tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "Love you to the moon and back," he whispered. "Love you to the stars and beyond," she replied, the way they always did. Later, Marcus stood in the tiny kitchen, sipping what remained of the soup. The apartment buzzed quietly, the hum of the fridge, the ticking of a wall clock that never kept perfect time. He glanced at the sink, still dripping. The landlord had promised to fix it months ago. Another thing he'd have to do himself. He looked around the room, photos taped to the fridge. Lily's shoes by the door. Maria's picture in the worn frame by the bookshelf. Her laugh was frozen in that photo. Arms around a younger Marcus and a 5-year-old Lily at the lake. It felt like another lifetime. Rain tapped against the windows, steady and calming. Exhaustion settled deep in his bones. He stretched out on the couch, too tired to move to the bedroom. He thought of the man on the road, of that moment in the storm. Just help someone else someday. Maybe it still mattered. Sometime later, it started with a smell sharp, acrid, wrong. Marcus's eyes snapped open. The living room bathed in an eerie orange glow. Then the sound hit, shouting, alarms, footsteps thudding overhead. Smoke curled under the front door. His heart raced. Lily. He was on his feet in an instant, coughing as he stumbled down the hall. Her bedroom door flew open and she looked up, panicked. "Dad, what's happening? There's a fire. We need to go." He grabbed her coat from the hook, wrapped it around her shoulders, then grabbed the teddy bear from her bed and shoved it into her arms. "Stay low," he said. "Breathe through this." He handed her the edge of his shirt. They moved together through the hallway, crouched, eyes stinging. The door wasn't hot. He opened it carefully, revealing a hallway filled with smoke and shouting neighbors. Everyone out, someone screamed from the stairwell. It's spreading fast. Marcus pulled Lily close and they ran. Down the stairs, past the smoke, out into the night. The cold air hit like a slap. People crowded in the parking lot, some in pajamas, others with just blankets thrown over their shoulders. Fire trucks arrived seconds later, sirens blaring, red lights flashing across the walls of the building. Flames licked up the side of the structure, angry and alive. Black smoke poured from the lower floors. The landlord stood off to the side, face pale, mumbling about old wiring, blown fuses. None of it mattered now. Marcus held Lily tight, one arm wrapped around her as they watched their world burn. "Dad," she whispered, "our stuff." Mom's picture. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat was thick. Everything inside him was screaming. Water rained from the hoses, steam rising where it hit heat. Ash floated like snow. By dawn, the fire was out. What the flames hadn't destroyed, the smoke and water had. The fire chief told the residents they couldn't return for now. Unsafe, structurally compromised. They were told to go to the community center, 2 blocks away. Volunteers would help. The Red Cross, emergency housing, forms to fill out. Marcus didn't speak. Lily walked beside him, coat too big, her teddy bear tucked under her chin. That bear had made it. The photo hadn't. Later, standing beneath a flickering fluorescent light in the shelter, Marcus stared down at the space where their names had just been written on a paper roster. He thought about how fast it had all gone. One night, one spark, and everything they had was ash. He closed his eyes and saw Maria's face, her smile, her hands in his, her voice telling him to be strong. He reached into his pocket out of habit and felt nothing. The wallet, the keys, the picture left behind. He opened his eyes again. Lily was sitting on a cot, legs swinging, still holding that bear. When she looked at him, she didn't cry. She just nodded. And somehow, that made it worse. Not because she was brave, but because she was learning too early how to be. Marcus looked back at the sky, still gray from smoke. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried, but the fire didn't care. The night didn't answer." And Maria's picture was gone, along with everything else. The shelter smelled like old coffee, bleach, and the faint trace of sorrow that clung to the walls no matter how clean they kept them. Marcus had been there for 5 nights, though it already felt like a season had passed. The cots were thin, the lights harsh, and the quiet was rarely peaceful, filled instead with coughs, murmurs, and the weight of people trying not to fall apart. He and Lily had claimed a corner near the back, separated by a donated curtain for privacy. At night, he could hear her breathing just a few feet away, curled up with her teddy bear, clutching it like it might hold together the little bit of childhood she had left. Each morning, Marcus woke early, dressed in the same jeans and flannel he'd worn since the fire, and headed out with a folder of resumes under one arm. There weren't many places looking for mechanics that week, fewer still willing to take someone without a permanent address. He tried a dealership first. The manager looked him up and down, lips tight. "We need full background," the man said, tapping the form, "including current address. We don't hire off the grid." Marcus offered a polite nod, thanked him for his time, and walked out before the sting could reach his eyes. It was like that everywhere. No address, no job, no job, no address. A loop you couldn't break without someone willing to take a chance. And no one was in the mood for chances. By Thursday, he had 5 rejections and a bus pass that was almost out of credit. He spent the morning walking to save what was left. Lily had stayed at the community center, where volunteers ran a makeshift school. She still smiled when he dropped her off, still tried to act like it was an adventure. He didn't have the heart to tell her how thin the road beneath them had become. Around noon, Marcus stopped at a gas station for water. He stood by the drink cooler for a moment, checking the prices. Then he saw Lily, standing near the snack rack, holding a small bag of crackers in her hands. Her face was bright, her eyes hopeful. "Dad, look," she said, pointing at a hand-drawn sign on the shelf. "It says free." Before Marcus could speak, the clerk snapped from behind the counter. "That's for purchases over $20. Kid, put it back." The tone was sharp, almost angry. Lily froze. The smile faded. Marcus stepped in, placed the crackers on the counter. "I'll pay for them," he said quietly. "And the water," the clerk grumbled. "Rang it up." Marcus handed over the last of the cash in his pocket. He didn't say anything on the walk out, but Lily did. "I'm sorry. Dad, I thought it was free." Marcus stopped, crouched beside her. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. But the truth was harder. It wasn't the crackers. It wasn't the sign. It was that she looked embarrassed, and he couldn't protect her from that. That night, he sat on the steps outside the shelter, a paper bag in his lap. Inside were tools, wrenches, ratchets, sockets, each one with his father's initials carved into the metal. M.W. for Michael Williams. His dad had been a mechanic for 30 years. The set was old, worn smooth by time and grease, but solid, real. Marcus had kept them through every move, every storm. He'd taught Lily how to clean them, how to recognize each one by feel. He stared at the bag a long time before standing. The pawn shop wasn't far. The bell above the door jingled when he entered, and the man behind the glass barely looked up. Marcus placed the bag on the counter and opened it carefully, reverently. "How much?" he asked. The man glanced inside, poked around a bit. $250, he said. Marcus didn't move. The man sighed. "All right, 400. Final offer." Marcus nodded once, took the cash, walked out. Outside, the wind had picked up. Clouds gathered again in the distance. Storms were never far behind these days. He didn't tell Lily, just said they'd be okay for a few more days. She smiled, trusted him, believed him. That night, as she fell asleep on the cot, Bear tucked under her arm, Marcus sat beside her with his head in his hands. It wasn't the apartment he missed. It wasn't the furniture or even the picture of Maria. It was that set of tools, the feel of them in his hands, the weight of his father's legacy, gone for $400. $400 to buy time. $400 to keep moving. And as he sat there in the dark, Marcus wondered how much more he could lose before there was nothing left to give. 3 days after pawning the tools, Marcus received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He was sitting outside the shelter on a borrowed lawn chair, the morning sun cutting through a break in the clouds. The voice on the line was calm, professional. A woman. She said she was an assistant to someone who wished to speak with him, someone Marcus had helped not long ago. "He asked specifically for you," she said. "Transportation will be arranged. No cost." Marcus frowned, his instincts bristling. Scams came in all shapes, and people didn't just send cars for strangers who change a tire in the rain. "Who is he?" he asked. A pause. He'd prefer to explain in person. The next morning, a black sedan pulled up outside the shelter. The driver wore a suit and offered only a nod before opening the door. Marcus hesitated, one hand still in his coat pocket, the other gripping the strap of the second-hand duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He glanced back at the building, at Lily watching from the window of the common room, her hand raised in a small wave. He gave her a nod, the kind that promised he'd be back soon, then climbed in. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. Through neighborhoods he hadn't walked in years, past steel and glass towers that stretched toward the sky. The car pulled into an underground garage and stopped beside a private elevator. The driver gestured. "He's waiting for you on the top floor." Marcus stepped inside. The elevator was silent, lined with polished wood and chrome. No buttons, no floor numbers. Just a panel that blinked once, then began its smooth ascent. When the doors opened, Marcus found himself in a quiet lobby, too quiet. He stepped out cautiously, boots echoing against marble. A young woman greeted him, tablet in hand. "Mr. Williams, right this way." She led him through a hallway of glass offices and modern art. No one else in sight. Marcus's eyes scanned everything. He was out of place here, wrapped in his only decent jacket, sleeves worn at the cuffs. He felt every crease, every scuff. They passed a reception desk, then another hallway, then another. "He's just finishing a meeting," she said. "Won't be long." Marcus stopped walking. "Listen," he said quietly. "I don't know what this is, but if this is a pitch or a trick." She turned, expression soft. "It's not. He just wants to talk." Still, something didn't sit right. Marcus stood by the glass wall overlooking the city, watching cars move like ants on the streets below. He looked at the exit, wondered if he should leave. Just walk out, go back to Lily. This was all too strange. He turned to go. The elevator chimed. Marcus paused. The doors opened, and a tall man stepped out. Soaked gray hair combed back, trimmed beard, leather jacket worn like second skin. Marcus blinked. The man stared at him, eyes narrowing slightly, then softening. It took a second, then another. Recognition bloomed. "You," Marcus said, almost under his breath. Harrison Ford gave a quiet smile. "You changed my tire in a storm and wouldn't take a dime." Hard to forget. Marcus just stared. "I didn't know." Ford stepped closer, extended a hand. "I've been trying to find you for days. Turns out people who don't take money also don't leave much of a trail." Marcus took his hand slowly. Words stuck somewhere between shock and disbelief. "You're—" He trailed off. Ford chuckled, voice low and familiar. "Still me. Just a little older than the last movie poster." Marcus found himself smiling, despite everything. "Guess I didn't recognize you soaking wet in a rainstorm. You and half the country," Ford said. "But that night meant something to me. You stopped. You helped. Not for anything. Just because." Marcus looked down, unsure what to say. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "It's what we're supposed to do." Ford nodded. "That's exactly why I asked you here." Marcus looked up again, heart still racing. "You said you were looking for me?" Ford held his gaze. "I have a reason, and if you'll give me a few more minutes, I'll explain everything." Marcus nodded slowly. Somehow, without realizing it, he'd stepped into a story that was no longer just his own. The office was nothing like Marcus expected. No gold trim, no movie posters, no display of fame, just dark wood, clean lines, and a quiet presence that mirrored the man who sat behind the desk. Harrison Ford leaned back in his chair, sleeves rolled up, hands folded in front of him. He didn't speak at first, just studied Marcus with a calm that felt more curious than commanding. On the far wall, a framed photo of an old biplane hung beside a black and white picture of a younger Ford, oil on his hands, grinning in front of a wooden workbench. "I want to offer you a job," Ford finally said. "No buildup, no speech, just that." Marcus sat still. "What kind of job?" Ford motioned toward the window, where the skyline shimmered under gray light. "I have a collection. Vehicles, mostly. Planes, some vintage machinery. I've kept it low profile. A few mechanics manage the general upkeep, but I'm looking for someone to take a more hands-on role. Someone who sees more than just machines. Someone who knows the value of what can't be replaced." Marcus's brow furrowed. "You want me to be your mechanic?" Ford smiled faintly. "Not just a mechanic, a caretaker." The words hung heavy in the room. Marcus looked down at his boots, scuffed, faded, still damp from the morning rain. "Why me?" he asked. "You could hire anyone. People with degrees, people who didn't lose everything in a fire and sleep in shelters." Ford's voice was steady. "Because I've been you." Marcus looked up. Ford leaned forward. "When I was your age, I was building cabinets. Couldn't get an acting job to save my life. Studios told me I had the wrong look, wrong voice, wrong everything. I'd show up for auditions and leave with nothing but sawdust on my jeans. I wasn't anybody, just a guy with calloused hands and a quiet temper. Marcus didn't speak. He wasn't sure if he could. Ford continued. One day, someone gave me a shot, not because they had to, because they saw something. And when I met you on that road, soaked and tired and still willing to help a stranger, I saw the same thing. Not charity, not desperation, integrity, the kind you can't fake. Silence stretched between them. Ford stood. Let me show you something. They left the office and walked through a secure hallway that opened into an elevator. This time, the ride was shorter. When the doors opened again, Marcus was met with the gleam of chrome, the quiet hum of stored engines, the soft scent of motor oil and history. The garage was vast but warm. Dozens of machines lined the space motorcycles from the 60s. War-era planes restored to full shine. Vintage cars with leather seats that told stories without words. Marcus stepped in slowly, his eyes wide, hands unconsciously brushing the air like he might wake up if he touched anything. This is what I've built, Ford said. Not for show, for the love of it, and it needs someone who treats it like it matters. Marcus turned to him, voice low. I'm not used to being offered things like this. I'm not used to offering them, Ford replied. But here we are. Marcus looked down again. The weight of every failure, every rejection, every moment he'd told Lily were okay when they weren't pressed against his ribs like a bruise. I don't know if I'm what you think I am, he said. Ford didn't flinch. I know exactly who you are, and I think maybe you've forgotten. Marcus felt something shift then, not dramatically, just a quiet settling of doubt that had lived in his chest too long. He extended his hand, rough and worn, and Ford took it without hesitation. All right, Marcus said softly. I'm in. The handshake was firm, simple, but something in Marcus's chest cracked open. Just a little. Not because he'd landed a job, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone saw him as more than broken, and that was enough to begin again. The new apartment wasn't fancy, but it was clean. 2 bedrooms, a working heater, windows that didn't rattle in the wind. Lily claimed the smaller room and lined the windowsill with her drawing sunsets, spaceships, and a lopsided picture of the 3 of them, her, Marcus, and the teddy bear. The walls smelled of fresh paint. The fridge hummed steadily. For the first time in weeks, Marcus could hear silence that didn't feel like loss. He was waking up in a bed instead of a cot, making coffee in a kitchen that didn't belong to 50 other people. There was dignity in the small routines returning. Each morning, he dropped Lily off at her new school before heading to the garage. She'd smile, adjusting the 2 big backpack Ford had bought her, and walk into that brick building with its peeling paint and new beginnings. But Marcus noticed it by the 3rd day, the shift in her shoulders, the quiet at dinner, the forced cheer in her voice. She didn't say much, and he didn't press, until Thursday. They were sitting at the tiny kitchen table, sharing leftover lasagna when she finally spoke. Some girls said I smell like a shelter. Marcus froze mid-bite. Lily didn't look up. She poked at her food like it had wronged her. They said I probably stole stuff from the snack cart, because that's what shelter kids do. She said it with a flatness that broke something deep in his chest. Marcus set his fork down, gently. Did you tell the teacher? Yeah. She said it's just how kids are, that it'll pass. Her voice cracked on the last word. Just a little. He didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the crackers at the gas station, the way Lily had flinched when that man yelled. He kept thinking about every time he told her they'd be okay, even when they weren't. Now they were safe, but the ghosts hadn't left. They just wore new faces. At the garage the next day, Marcus worked in silence. The space was everything he'd ever wanted: tools polished, parts organized, engines waiting like puzzles he could finally solve again. Ford dropped by mid-morning, checking on a restored de Havilland plane. He noticed Marcus's quiet and asked nothing until lunch. They sat on the hood of a 1966 Mustang, eating sandwiches, surrounded by steel and sunlight. Ford glanced over. "You're somewhere else today." Marcus hesitated and then told him about the school, the words, the look in Lily's eyes. Ford didn't interrupt. When Marcus finished, he simply nodded. "It's hard," he said. "We teach them how to survive, but not how to forget." Marcus looked down. "I just want her to feel like she belongs." Ford stood, brushing crumbs from his jacket. "What time's her practice?" Marcus blinked. "What, basketball? Right, she plays." "Yeah, Friday afternoons." Ford looked at him. "I'll be there." And he was. That Friday, the gym smelled of rubber and echoing sneakers. Parents sat scattered in the bleachers, half on their phones, half pretending to care. Lily stood on the court, ponytail swaying, trying not to look at the three girls whispering near the bench. Marcus sat alone near the back, heart pounding like he was the one about to shoot free throws. Then the door opened, and Harrison Ford walked in. He didn't say a word, just took a seat beside Marcus like he'd been doing it for years. A few heads turned. One father nudged another. Someone whispered, "Isn't that?" But Ford's eyes stayed on Lily. She saw him, froze, then smiled, just barely. He raised a hand, subtle. She waved back, hope flickering behind her eyes like sunrise behind clouds. The girls on the bench stopped whispering. After practice, Lily ran over, breathless. Was that Marcus nodded? He just came to watch. Why, she asked, still glowing. Marcus looked at her. Really looked. Because he thinks you're worth watching. That night, as she slept, curled up beneath a real blanket on a real bed. Marcus stood at the window, arms crossed. He watched the lights of the city flicker, the streets below full of people rushing somewhere, carrying something unseen. Grief, fear, hope. He thought about Ford's words. We teach them how to survive, but not how to forget. But maybe the forgetting wasn't the point. Maybe it was learning to believe again, not in luck, not in rescue, but in the idea that even the broken can be seen as whole. Because the hardest part of starting over isn't the rebuilding, it's believing you deserve to. The conference room was nothing extravagant, no velvet curtains, no cameras flashing, no big celebrity rollout, just a clean whiteboard, a row of chairs, and a simple podium at the front. But something about the silence in that space made it feel bigger, more personal. Harrison Ford stood at the front, hands folded, his voice steady as he spoke to a room full of community leaders, local reporters, and people who had known hardship too well. He called it the Silent Good Foundation, a project built not on headlines or hashtags, but on the quiet belief that even the smallest kindness could reroute a life. It would fund emergency housing, job training, childcare, and mental health support for families hit by unexpected crisis. No red tape, no long interviews, just real help when it mattered most. When Ford finished speaking, he looked toward the back of the room. Marcus stood there in a simple button-up, unsure if he'd ever get used to how far he'd come from the night everything burned. Ford smiled. "And this," he said, "will be led by a man who knows what it's like to fall and stand again. A man who helped a stranger on a stormy road without asking for anything in return." There was a pause. "Marcus Williams," Ford said, "is our program director." Applause rippled through the room. Marcus stepped forward slowly, unsure whether his legs were carrying him or just habit. He took the microphone, not because he wanted to speak, but because sometimes silence doesn't say enough. He looked out at the faces in front of him. Then he told them about Maria, about how she used to say you don't measure love by what you keep, but by what you're willing to give away. He said the fund would carry her name, not because she needed a plaque, but because everything he'd rebuilt came from the way she had loved without conditions. And then he said the line, the same one he'd spoken on that dark highway, with rain soaking through his jacket and pain still fresh in his chest. Just help someone else someday. That would be the Foundation's mission, its motto, its reason for existing. Not a slogan, a cycle. That afternoon, the sky turned soft and gold, as if the world had exhaled. Marcus and Lily walked through the park, leaves crunching under their feet, the breeze tugging gently at her braids. She skipped ahead, arms out like airplane wings, then circled back to walk beside him, her small hand slipping into his. They passed a fountain, a bench, a street musician playing something slow and beautiful. The kind of tune you don't hum, but feel. Lily looked up. Dad, yeah. She squinted against the light. We help people now, because someone helped us. Right. Marcus stopped walking, looked at her, then nodded. Yeah, baby, he said. That's exactly why. She smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't need anything more. The wind blew gently. In the distance, the world kept moving. But in that moment, everything had finally come full circle. From a flat tire on a rainy night to a life rebuilt, not by luck, but by something quieter, something stronger. Silent good. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.